a three-body building and a 40,000 square meter park which few knew was a religious school for deaf boys. All that until November 25th when a complaint tore the veil of silence. The accusation stated that at the Antonio Provolo Institute in Lujan, they sexually abused the boys interned in the institution. At 505 Boedo Street in the city of Luján de Cuyo, Mendoza, Argentina, stood an imposing building, the Provolo Institute. It was one of the several global headquarters of the Company of Mary for the Education of the Deaf and Mute, a religious institution that provided support to hearing-impaired boys and girls. The building was also dark and closed off, as if it held a secret. For decades, the children spent long hours there. They learned to read, write, and navigate in a world often hostile to those with a disability. The Provolo Institute seemed like a safe place, an opportunity for them to gain tools for an independent and self-sufficient life. Among the students, bonds were formed, and many years after finishing their studies, some would gather to reminisce about the old times. But there was something that was not mentioned, a memory shared by all and that no one could utter. Something they hadn't even told their families. At the Provolos Institute, the priests were sexually abusing the students daily and for many years. Everyone seemed to operate with total impunity because, after all, those boys couldn't communicate like the others until someone broke that terrifying silence. First, it was a journalistic investigation in Italy, the country of origin of that religious congregation, and then a young woman from Mendoza who decided to publicly tell what was happening in Argentina. It was the beginning of an unprecedented investigation in the history of crimes perpetrated by religious figures. And finally, the guilty would pay for their utterly abhorrent crimes. Lately, my daughter 3 months ago didn't want to come to school. On Monday and Wednesday, she cried, but she didn't tell me why she didn't want to go to school. I sent her. Children of various backgrounds attended the Provolo Institute. Some only did so during the day for classes and workshops, while others practically lived in that place. They belonged to humble families who could not take care of all the needs they required and therefore spent long periods at the institute as boarders or students. So without knowing it, those families were handing their little ones over to the very claws of a network of abusers of the smallest ones. But who would suspect those priests and nuns who seemed devoted to such a noble cause? And it's that outwardly they seemed empathetic, loving, and very attentive to the needs of their little students. Not only did they teach them, but they also fed them, cleaned them, supported them, and assisted them in everything they needed. But on weekends and at night, everything changed. In those moments when the number of students was reduced to a minimum and only those who could not go home to their families remained, the place turned into a hell. The nuns made sure that all the little ones went to bed without their headphones on. They said it was to protect those fragile devices from possible breaks, but the reason was much more perverse. They didn't want them to hear the screams that shattered the tranquility of the night in those long corridors of rooms. But how had that ordeal, that terror, started? The truth is that it's hard to establish a date, but perhaps it was around the year 1972 when a priest with an Italian name arrived in the Argentine city of La Plata. His name was Nicola Corradi, and he came directly from Verona in the north of Italy to transmit the teachings of Antonio Provolo, a Catholic priest who in the 19th century dedicated his life to helping the deaf community. Corradi remained in La Plata until 1998 without anyone suspecting his true intentions. His secret remained safe, but the truth was that he had been transferred from Italy because it was suspected that sooner or later that cesspool, that murkiness that exists in abusive fathers would be uncovered. Far from paying for his crimes in Europe, as you realize, he perfected his system of abuse 62 miles away from his homeland. And so, when Corradi left the Provolo in La Plata, it was not due to a complaint, but a promotion. He had won the position of director at the headquarters of the institute they had just founded in Mendoza. Until 2006, his crimes completely flew under the radar of the authorities and the families of his victims. In nearly 4 decades, he had been able to move with total freedom and unrestricted access to hundreds of innocent disabled people who were under his care. Then it was a common thing. At that time, yes. So does that mean all the priests did it a bit? Content violation. Yes. And the priests, when it was known, were they removed? Eliminated. When were the abuses discovered? There was Don Turati, for example, who did those things, and then to America. Were they sent when it was discovered that they had abused children? To Argentina. In 2006, 50 former students of the institute, but from the Italian headquarters, asked for a meeting with the high command of the institution to demand that they separate almost 30 priests suspected of having intimately abused minors. But no one paid attention to their requests, and 3 years later, the complaint broke into the media. The weekly El Expresso de Milano published the testimonies of 15 former students who reported having been abused between 1954 and 1984. Only then did the Vatican take action and formed an investigative commission, but that was just the tip of the iceberg of what was really happening in Argentina. It was enough to pull the thread of that investigation in Verona to discover the horror, the crap that was stored there in these priests who deployed, as I tell you, the priests and nuns of this institute in South America. And by crap, I mean the perversions they were committing. In Italy, there was no justice. The Vatican, strangely enough, only blamed one priest and sentenced him to dedicate himself to penance and prayers. In other words, they did nothing to him, just so you understand. In the name of justice, all cases were no longer tried elsewhere, but in Argentina, it was a different story. Very delicate, to never spoil. For steel. Scratched. Diana Lizarraga was 28 years old and was going through a very deep depression. Something in her was pressing to come out, but she didn't know exactly what. One day, she decided to go to the Mendocina legislature and asked for a sign language interpreter. The information came out of her like an unstoppable waterfall. She reported that there were constant abuses and mistreatment in the Mendoza Probolo. Her parents discovered everything then. Diana had never been able to put in words what she had experienced in her childhood when she went to the place. She had left school at 18, but for a decade she was tormented by the idea that her friends were still suffering what she herself had endured. Her complaint was like a snowball. Suddenly, it was revealed that the cases were counted by the dozens. The crap started to float. Perhaps the cases were in the thousands. When the boys looked out the windows of this institute as night fell, it was the prelude to horror. Some of the little ones were tied up by their hands and feet, sometimes these same ones, but the older ones were forced to abuse the younger ones while the priests watched everything. The testimonies that justice was collecting were becoming more and more terrible, and what was happening in the Provolo seemed to surpass all imaginable horror. As the boys and adults began to speak, the names of the abusers also began to appear. Nicolas Corrades was one of the most emblematic, but not the only one, of course. Priest Horacio Corbacho was second in command to Corradi, and another who always appeared in the victims' testimonies. Indeed, between the years 2005 and 2016, a mechanism of systematic abuse and a pact of silence had been deployed in Provolo that seemed to encompass the entire leadership of the institution. The question that was then raised was, could anyone working there ignore what was happening every night? As the investigation progressed, the accusation not only reached priests Corradi and Corbacho, but also a gardener from the institute named Armando Gomez, who also participated in the abuses, an administrative employee named Jorge Bordon, who was nicknamed the Altar Boy, and finally another employee who served as a caretaker for the children and whose identity was not revealed as he was considered unprosecutable by justice. All had actively abused the children for at least 10 years, and in the sight of those who looked after the care staff at the institute, that is, the nuns, which means the involvement in this case of Kosaka Kumiko. This is the Japanese nun who ended up surrendering to the federal police, who made a statement of 10-11 hours yesterday before the prosecutors in Mendoza, and that for justice, And this is the really disturbing data. As Belen was advancing for justice, Kosaka Kumiko not only handed over minors for priests to abuse, but she actively participated in the abuses. Kumiko Kosaka was very well known among the kids who attended the Probolo. In secret to science, they nicknamed her the Bad Nun. At first, it seemed to be because she was very strict, cold, and more distant than the others. Over time, they said she beat the little ones and was aware of the abuses. It didn't take long to formulate the hypothesis that she also perpetrated the same abuses. The investigation revealed another sinister detail about the nuns, as if that wasn't enough. They seemed to be in charge of determining through beatings who were submissive and who were rebellious. The former were handed over to the abusers. The little ones who faced her in the midst of the beatings were saved because they had more chances to later dare to report what had happened to them. The details of all the testimonies completely chill the blood because they allow us to glimpse the level of perversion and impunity with which this network was handled for decades. This case is really quite strong. The forcefulness of the complaints seemed to pave the way for a quick trial that would put an end to such suffering and all the guilty behind bars. But every judicial plot, especially in the Argentine criminal system, also has its twists and turns and its dead ends. And the fact is that in order to convict the authors of such barbarity, a large but at the same time meticulous investigation had to be put together. If there were cases in Verona and in Mendoza, the dark trail of Nicola had to be followed in every place he had passed through in his disastrous priestly career. That's how justice, to expand the investigation outside of the Mendoza province, also arrived in La Plata to discover if there were also victims willing to tell what happened there. The Human Trafficking and Pedophilia Prosecutor's Office in La Plata was enlisted on February 22, 2017 to hear the testimony of other former students of the institute and to finish assembling the map of the Profolo case. The judges in La Plata followed the path traced by Corradi and Corbacho and were at the same time convinced that their names also appeared in the new testimonies and they were not mistaken. Corbacho had worked at the Provolo Institute in La Plata and at the Our Lady of Mercy School in the same city until February 2017, while Corradi had done so at the Institute of La Plata in the 90s. It was then possible to imagine that they had implemented a plan of abuse within such a radius and for such a number of years. How far could the perversion of these priests go? The testimonies would provide an answer, and it is that in the province of Salta, located in the north of Argentina and 310.689 miles away from La Plata, a witness identified as Daniel S. said that he had been a victim of Corradi. The complaints were coming from every corner of the country, and it didn't take long for confirmation to come from Italy that the Catholic hierarchy was aware of everything. What a surprise, this always happens. But well, while the investigation was moving steadily forward in Argentine territory, the surviving networks of ecclesiastical abuse in Italy revealed that there were several previous complaints in the old continent against that sinister priest who was now being investigated in Argentina. Since 2009, the complaints had been piling up, and by 2012, 3 cases had been confirmed. However, the church had not taken any action against the targeted priest. And in Argentina, a question began to gain strength and put everything into perspective. Was Pope Francis aware of everything? It should be remembered that the Supreme Pontiff is Argentine, and before being appointed to the head of the Vatican, he served as Archbishop of Buenos Aires under his birth name, Jorge Mario Bergoglio. Francesco Zanardi, president of the Abuse Network, stated that on May 9, 2014, one of the most watched newscasts in Italy broadcast a video that was replicated by all Italian national media and others around the world, directed precisely at Pope Francis. But the Vatican never responded. Neither did the Bishop of Verona, Giuseppe Senti, when organizations defending victims of these sick people contacted to ask that Corradi and 14 other sick people be removed from their duties of caring for the little ones with disabilities. Yesterday, the UN, the United Nations organization, issued a statement basically rushing the Vatican. It gives a deadline of 60 days to provide details and modify the canonical investigation against the priests. But why did the church remain silent about the intimate abuse allegations against Corradi and Corbacho until the case finally exploded in the media in 2017? Some questions perhaps because we will never be able to answer or know them. Regardless of the role of the church, justice was already on the trail of the abusers. As the testimonies piled up, the accused began to be arrested. A hearing is scheduled for the accused Corbacho to testify. It's at 8 in the morning. He is exercising his right to defense, and well, we are all very eager to see what he is going to testify. Declare what he declares, and we honestly do not understand that there is a position that improves him in the situation in which he is. That is, the level of guilt that already exists is proven in that framework of impunity seems to have had a key role in the nun that everyone pointed out. For that reason, on April 1st, 2017, the Justice of Mendoza also ordered the capture of Kosaka Kumiko. However, when the authorities went to look for her, Kumiko had disappeared. Let me tell you the story of this bad nun. Kosaka Kumiko was born in the Japanese city of Okazaki, but arrived in Argentina as a baby in the year 1977. She dedicated her entire life to the Christian faith and received the habits in the year 2000 under the Congregation of Daughters of Mary Most Holy of the Garden. Her role as a caretaker of the little ones at the Provolo Institute in Mendoza had given her privileged access to every corner of the building. Everyone knew her, and she knew everyone, big and small, everyone. When her name then began to appear in the victims' testimonies, Kumiko knew that her days of freedom were numbered. First, they pointed her out as a link to the sick priests, and later as a perpetrator of some of the abuses. By the year 2017, Kumiko was no longer in Pro Bolo. She had left Mendoza 4 years earlier and was teaching catechism classes in Buenos Aires, specifically in the city of Bella Vista. When she was notified that the police were coming for her, Kumiko stopped going to the places she used to frequent. For a month, justice sought her. The nun seemed to have hidden from everyone, and there was even the possibility that she had escaped from Argentina, perhaps covered by the church or by her own means through contacts in her family in Japan. However, a few weeks after her arrest warrant was issued, the nun was arrested. The image went around the world. Dressed in her habit and a bulletproof vest with the initials of the Argentine Federal Police, the woman had her hands cuffed in front, her fingers interlaced, her gaze lowered, and she was surrounded by 2 female police officers. Can you imagine the embarrassment that surely, well, who knows if she has, but I say this woman felt? Well, when Kumiko arrived at the courts, she testified for 9 hours in front of the prosecutors, but she didn't say anything. She claimed that everything was a lie, that she hadn't seen any abuse at the school, that she was no longer guilty of any of the crimes she was accused of, and that children can sometimes lie. But so many could lie, I doubt it. Kumiko only spent 4 months behind bars because in September 2017, the justice system granted her the benefit of house arrest. And while the sick priest waited in prison, Kumiko, their alleged accomplice, also a monster, would do so at home as if she had done nothing. But now let's return to the Vatican.
And in 2018, several striking events occurred in the case.
In the early days of January, the premises where the school was located were packed. Early in the morning, gendarmes, lawyers, plaintiffs, staff from the public prosecutor's office of Mendoza, and even gardeners hired by the municipality of Luján de Cuyo had arrived. They had a terrifying task. They had to search every inch of the building and all the adjoining land for any human remains, from lifeless bodies of little ones to even fetuses hidden in the place. In the search, they also hoped to find underground corridors and money that the abusers could have hidden over those years to erase all traces of what they had done. Among the testimonies collected up to that point, some former students remembered having seen or heard about burials in sites near the institute, which sought to hide the priests and nuns under the cover of night. That was the question. And so, with a ground-penetrating radar, the authorities combed every inch of soil to look for something hidden from human sight. The results did not add major revelations to the case, but with the testimonies it seemed enough to face the first mega trial that promised to be a before and after in Argentine judicial history, or perhaps the biggest judicial failure in a long time. All the cards were on the table. Justice ordered this Monday the dismissal of one of the accused for sexual abuse at the Antonio Provolo Institute. This is about the former administrative employee whose name we precisely preserve because, according to the reports of the forensic medical body, he is a subject who does not understand the criminality of the facts, who is hard of hearing, and according to all these expert reports, he didn't even understand that he was subject to judicial process. On September 25, 2018, the altar boy Jorge Bordon and former administrative employee at the institute confessed to having abused children and received a sentence of 10 years in prison. What a bargain. I mean, nothing. It was a summary trial in the first conviction of the case. What everyone was waiting for was the mega trial scheduled for August 2019. On that day, the accused Corradi, Corbacho, and Gomez would finally face the more than 200 victims who ratified their testimony before justice. They were intense days, very difficult for the witnesses and relatives who had to expose again and in great detail the abuses suffered for so long in the Provolo. Some of the victims were so shocked that they could not appear in court. Imagine the trauma, but their testimonies did reach the ears of the judges. Finally, so much effort and persistence on the part of the complainants bore fruit, and the accused were found guilty of the abuses. Their sentences were exemplary for a case of these characteristics in Argentina and in the world. The Italian priest, Nicola Corradi, 83 years old at the time of the trial, was sentenced to 42 years in prison. His second, the priest Horacio Corbacho, 59 years old, received a sentence of 45 years in prison. He's also going to rot. Meanwhile, the gardener Armando Gomez, who was tried along with the religious, was also sentenced to 18 years in prison for taking advantage of two minors. Something we can say quite a short time. Similarly, the sentence was broadcasted online, but only the convicts and their victims were present in the room. When the sentences were announced, the former students of the institute raised their hands and waved them from side to side. In sign language, it was a way of saying that justice had been achieved or that the truth had been reached. An Italian priest convicted by Argentine justice for sexual abuse and rape of deaf minors died on Wednesday at the age of 84. Nicola Corradi had received a 42-year prison sentence in 2019 and was serving house arrest due to his age and health problems. The bittersweet feeling that Corradi had lost his life condemned, but being so old that he only spent a few years in prison would be just one of the difficult moments to navigate for the victims and their families from that moment on. Although the first trial had been decisive and with high sentences, the wound from those years of horror was evidently going to be very difficult to close. But if divine justice exists, I hope that at this moment all these people are rotting in hell. Similarly, in 2020, relatives of the victims went to the Vatican to request an audience with Pope Francis. It was a way to close a cycle, to understand what role the church had played in those years of deafening silence. Guess what? Pope Francis didn't receive them. The only direct mention of the case by the ecclesiastical structure came from the auxiliary bishop of La Plata, Alberto Germán, appointed in May 2017 apostolic commissioner by the Vatican to internally investigate the crimes in the institute. But this character, Alberto Germán, asked for forgiveness on behalf of the church and affirmed that the clergy never covered up for the priests in question. There were no more mentions by the religious hierarchy, and it was still left for justice to give a final word, the trial of the nuns. The last trial took place over 2 long years of hearing. Unlike the first, here the accused were all women. Among them stood out the already mentioned Kumiko, this Japanese, and a second nun, Asuncion Martinez. But the network of possible coverage did not only include religious women from the institute, but also directors of different levels. Former directors and employees also faced justice for the first time. They were Graciela Pascual, Gladys Pinaca, Noemi Paz, Valesca Quintana, Laura Gaitan, Cristina Leguiza, and the psychologist Cecilia Rajo. Then, in the second trial, which was particularly long and bloody for the plaintiffs, more than 100 witnesses in about 300 hearings reiterated everything that had happened in the hope that justice would once again be done. Then, by the month of October, everything seemed to be heading towards a conviction. The prosecution had asked for 25 years in prison for Kumiko for seriously outrageous intimate abuse and corruption of the very young, while the other defendants could face sentences of between 3 to 18 years for failure to report. Finally, the outcome of this trial was a hard blow for the families. Acquitting Kosaka Kumiko, acquitting Asuncion Martinez Aquino, acquitting Graciela Pascual Ibars. All the accused, including the non-Kumiko, were acquitted. Suddenly, 2 years of endless debate seemed to be in vain. Outrage and crying filled the courtroom when the victims heard that all the accused were released and their involvement in the events could not be proven. Similarly, the judicial decision was a surprise to everyone. The media reported on the unexpected outcome of this second mega trial. What else was there to do? A month after the acquittal, the prosecutors asked to annul the verdict. The decision was left in the hands of the Supreme Court of the province to review what was already shaping up as one of the most controversial decisions of recent years. So far, the court has not made a decision, and those ellipses generate unease in the victims who have slowly tried to heal the ordeal they experienced in their childhoods. But if you want me to do more cases like these that are related to the church or religion, leave them here below in the comment box. And also remember that in the little button here for members, you can have access to extra content. It costs around 50 pesos. It's a reasonable amount for having extra content, and it helps me to keep growing and make cooler videos.